Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Star Trek III: The Search for Spock from 1984. Here's the thing with Search for Spock. The biggest thing that's holding the Search for Spock back is really the reputation of the Wrath of Khan. I looked up any review I could from the time period, and almost every review compares this film to Wrath of Khan. Now, Wrath of Khan is pretty much the great Star Trek movie. It is the best Star Trek movie, and this being the sequel after Wrath of Khan, obviously it was going to be compared to that film. But does that make this film bad? And I don't actually think so. I think it is a very different film, and I think comparing them does this film a disservice. I still think it is a very sturdy entry in the Star Trek franchise. I think anytime you have a franchise, you have certain entries that kind of get maligned a little bit because they come after major entries in the franchise that are all-time classics and end up achieving more than your usual franchise entry would. And you have that with James Bond, Godzilla, and Star Trek as well. And I think with Wrath of Khan being probably one of the great blockbusters of the 1980s and greatest science fiction films of all time, a film that is just a fine Star Trek entry, a good Star Trek entry, but not one that made a franchise that most people really weren't that into after the first one come alive again and become very, very popular. I think most people kind of wanted a similar thing to Wrath of Khan, and Search for Spock isn't Wrath of Khan at all. It kind of sort of does that in some places, but in other places it kind of doesn't at all. This film, directed by Leonard Nimoy, is a lot more operatic. His intent as a director was to have it more operatic. It's less of a Captain Ahab, Moby Dick tale. Its villain really isn't as good as Khan. It doesn't really have the emotional beats and return to the original TV series. It's doing the original TV series thing. It's doing a bit of motion picture, but it's kind of doing its own thing. And if you watch its own thing, it's still pretty good. I know most people say this is just for Trekkies or Trekkers or whatever the fuck, but I still have always enjoyed this film. I know this is part of kind of the trilogy, or of the trilogy of films that really got played on TV a lot, which makes sense since this was based on a TV show. It kind of does something that we definitely do now in franchise filmmaking, which have continuity throughout our sequels, and this was very tight continuity, this being a very direct sequel to 2, the trilogy of 2, 3, and 4 that really captured my imagination as a kid. And although almost like everyone I watched 2 a lot more, I still always really liked 3. It's not really as fun and as silly and as environmental at all as 4, and it's not as awesome as 2, but it still has a special place kind of in my heart and a special place in the franchise. And even if you want to play the odd and even game, as most people like to do with Star Trek, which I guess Into Darkness took a big shit on, but The Search for Spock I think is more of an exception to the rule than the rule itself, and gives the Star Trek franchise one of its better and certainly a sturdy entry that the franchise can build on. Almost directly after Wrath of Khan, after the Enterprise is going back to Earth and they are docked at a space station, when Kirk realizes that Bones, played by DeForest Kelley of course, was Vulcan mind-melded from Spock before he died, and Spock put his memories and his brain in Bones. So Kirk decides they need to go back to Genesis, get Spock's body, which they believe may have been reincarnated, take both back to Vulcan, and have them both become whole again, as Bones is going through emotional crises, having 2 minds in his body and not exactly sure what to do, sometimes sounding like and even acting like Spock, in a very possessed, bizarre performance by DeForest Kelley, which I actually quite like. And so they decide to kidnap the Enterprise, which they are being told is going to be thrown away, as yet again in all the Star Trek film franchise the subject of age is brought up yet again. So they take the Enterprise and go to the planet that Genesis has been hatched on, and then find that there are Klingons there who have attacked the science expedition or trying to find out things about Genesis as the planet is destroying itself, and a young Spock who has been reincarnated by the Genesis device is aging rather quickly, just like the planet is, and Kirk and the Enterprise have to make a positive outcome come out of all of this nonsense. After Star Trek II was a massive hit, and after they started screening it, Leonard Nimoy actually regretted hanging up Spock, and many people thought he really hated Star Trek and wanted to kill off the character, something that it takes most people like Harrison Ford like 20 years to get done. But apparently Leonard Nimoy had a better agent or something, I don't know. They killed off Spock, and there was actually some debate whether he even wanted to come back, even though they certainly set up that he probably is coming back. But he went to Michael Eisner, who was the head of Paramount at the time, and actually convinced him that he should direct. And this was his feature film directorial debut, although he had directed TV and even directed William Shatner before, at least I believe so, on an episode of TJ Hooker, and had directed Night Gallery, and had directed some things. He wasn't coming in green, but this was his major feature film debut, and Michael Eisner let him do, and he agreed to return as Spock. So they made the only Star Trek film named after a character. That would be The Search for Spock. There was no like Kirk's Quest or something, I don't know. And that's an interesting idea. Certainly the director Nicholas Meyer of Wrath of Khan did not want to come back, and didn't really like, much like how Chris Claremont didn't like how Jean Grey came back, didn't really like how they brought back Spock. And I semi-agree, but it's kind of like these franchises, you kind of can't kill off Spock when you're talking about the original cast. I really wouldn't want to see that film, although that is most of this film. So I guess maybe I'd be okay with it. Most people realized they couldn't do that long term, and so they made this film. Nimoy's ideas of making this more operatic makes it, in fact, a little more melodramatic, but it gives it kind of an interesting feel to it because it is so much about death, and the theme of age feels more present than it ever has in all of these, although it's pretty present in all these Star Trek movies. Are like, we're older, but we're still here, and you're like, how? You're old in all these movies. It feels like a bigger budget version of the TV show, and I do like the cool thing about Star Trek as a TV show is each episode could be very different. That's kind of something I've always liked about Star Trek, is you can do different things with it. I mean, it's certainly the kind of violence that people would like in a blockbuster at the time, but I think because it is kind of doing a stranger thing, and I like the ideas and the idea of doing more of a melodramatic operatic thing and playing with death and dealing with death, which this film does, and having Shatner really dealing with like what's the right thing to do for his friends, the crew on the Enterprise. It's not really so much about doing this adventure and being swashbuckling Kirk as much. I mean, it is, and he still does that and he relies on those things, but it's more about what's good for his friends. These people represent something to him. Sulu and Scotty and Chekhov, and especially Spock and Bones, and how he needs to do right by them, and how his honor actually means something to him, just like you thought that guy in the original series did. So a lot of that has to do with that, and more how that honor means more to him than Starfleet or anything. How it really represents something to him, and how he needs to find the proper burial for his friend, which he didn't really do rightfully, but he felt he was doing the right thing at the time. But I guess he did, because then he could come back and stuff, so, you know, he kind of did. It's really more about that, which is the way to make it more dramatic, because it is a very dramatic idea. He doesn't know if he's going to be able to be in Starfleet anymore. He's really risking his whole career, and this film really plays up that. And I think the operatic nature of this works because of a lot of the interesting kind of sets they have, especially when the Genesis planet is coming apart, and particularly with James Horner's score, which really emphasizes the emotion. He came back from Wrath of Khan, and I think James Horner in both these films is so essential and so wonderful. Almost like plays off of kind of the interesting tones of Star Trek, but similar to like how important the scoring of science fiction was with like John Williams. James Horner really played with that, but in a different way. And I think, you know, I'm not a huge James Horner fan, but what he did with this film and the previous Star Trek film are just absolutely sensational. When the Enterprise explodes, that's a scene where he really ups the importance, and like people who might have been freaking out in the theater, although they weren't because it was blown for them in a trailer, probably did feel like tense, like, oh my god, I can't believe the Enterprise is going to be destroyed. And that sequence is given the emotional heft that it should, because that's an icon of pop culture, that's an icon of this series. It's pretty much a character. It's the place that we've been throughout this entire series. It's what's important to this crew, and it is played in a certain way. But I watched the trailer and it's like, you knew that was happening, and I guess it was trying to say like, hey, you liked how Spock died, look who's gonna die in this one, and you're like, what the what? And they do that with this, and they do it with Kirk's son David, which is like, didn't we just meet this guy, so we're killing him now? I didn't really like that at all. It wasn't really emotionally paid off very well, although Shatner really sells it. I think the thing with Shatner in this movie is almost every time he says a line, he looks like he's like, I fucking nailed that shit, I am the greatest, because he did a good job in Wrath of Khan. I know people always talk about how Shatner's this terrible actor. If you look at his job in Wrath of Khan, he did a very good job. I think he did one of his best performances in a Star Trek movie. But in this, it's like he has the confidence of Wrath of Khan going all throughout it, and he instead is a little hammy. He's not as hammy as people pretend he is, and probably is in the later Star Trek films or in later cheesier shows and whatnot, but he kind of sells it with too much confidence. But the sequence where he sees that his son died, I thought he plays particularly well, but it's still a good performance. It is playing more in the melodrama and stuff, so the hamminess kind of works for it, but it feels like a performance that's just a little bit off, which kind of, I think, also doesn't help the film. This film semi got good reviews. Apparently Pauline Kael didn't love it. Ronald Reagan actually said it's not too good. Search for Spock still has this kind of interesting, kind of spookier, very stranger feel to it, particularly emphasized by the performance of DeForest Kelley, who I think does actually a really interesting job. It's a much more interesting performance from DeForest Kelley than he really gets to do in Star Trek stuff, and I think they got to play a little bit more. They got to have fun moments. George Takei in the like "Don't call me Tiny" line, which he originally didn't like, is an awesome line, and shows because George Takei is awesome, so of course he can do something awesome. I really like the original cast in this film. I thought they should have emphasized Uhura a little more. They kind of just forget about her. She's just at the beginning and then gone, and she's at the end. I was like, why is she even in this movie? Like, it's just really unfortunate that they didn't really utilize her as well as they could have. I mean, she's part of the crew to me. And Christopher Lloyd is the main antagonist. He's often compared to Khan, and people are saying, oh, they're trying to make him Khan. I don't really feel like they are. He's just kind of a warlord, and I like the idea that in most action movies or superhero movies, and when there's this power that a villain's going after, that's soon kind of forgotten about or changed in a way, and this felt very natural. Like, of course, when Genesis happened, people would want it. It is a weapon of mass destruction. Although it would create life and create a ton of life and rejuvenate a moon and make a planet, it would just destroy everything that was there before. And so, of course, people wanted it, and the Klingons wanted it. And I love the bird of prey in this film is just glorious, and the special effects are absolutely amazing. Particularly the bird of prey. I just remember that bird of prey so clearly. And I did actually watch 2, 3, and 4 back to back so many times as a kid, and they do flow really well together, and you got used to that Genesis animation. I mean, they reused a lot of stuff, but it kind of works with the flow of these movies. And I like the villain, but it's not even trying to do the Ahab white whale thing. He's not really after Kirk. He's just after this weapon, and he just kind of feels like he's a hurdle they have to get through to get Spock. I mean, it's called The Search for Spock. It's not called Christopher Lloyd Klingon's Search for a Genesis weapon, you know? It's called The Search for Spock. So this film is more focused on that. They kind of like just look at him as a hurdle, which he is. I know people say they're trying to do the Khan thing. They are a little. If you don't try to fit this in the box of the other Trek films, I think you could appreciate it more, because it is kind of it doing its own thing. I never really got the motion picture stuff. I know people say it combines more of heavy sci-fi stuff, but I think it's doing a lot of things from the show, like the Vulcan mysticism, but it's also trying to do its own like weird operatic thing that Leonard Nimoy wanted to bring to it. I often like that about this film, but I like Christopher Lloyd a lot as a Klingon. God damn, Christopher Lloyd, like 2 years of the next year he would make Back to the Future. I mean, he made like 2 huge movies and 2 films I'd watch a lot growing up, so it shows his range as an actor. I love him as a Klingon. He's still probably up there in terms of the feature films, one of the better Star Trek villains. Not that he's anywhere close to Ricardo Montalban's Khan, but again, that film's more based on that kind of a villain. This film, you're not going to get a great villain out of it. And I think that's the other thing, is like most sequels are more about villains than they are the protagonists, and this film kind of breaks from that. Like Bond is criticized for that. Batman movies, superhero movies, all sorts of movies are criticized for focusing more on the villains, and this film defocuses from the villain after a film that focuses on a villain that absolutely everyone loves. Since it's so different, people often don't like it very much, and particularly because if you watch this on TV, these would be played back to back on TV. It definitely emphasizes the TV roots of Star Trek in doing so, and almost plays like how FX, who's got the movies from my understanding, plays the Marvel movies now. In that way, you'll end up marathoning Marvel movies while you're cleaning your apartment or something, or at least that's me. The Star Trek movies work that way, but in the 80s, and almost everyone who I mentioned Star Trek 3 to went, oh yeah, I remember watching that thing on TV like all the time. They play that way too much. 2, I think most people prefer, but that doesn't mean 3 is a bad movie. 3 is a sturdy entry into the Star Trek franchise. It's a fine blockbuster. It's a fine, good, decent blockbuster, and it gives you the action. It just does it in kind of a stranger way. And if you look at blockbuster now and you look at how bad Star Trek movies can really be, because we didn't know at that time it would get a lot worse, this really isn't as bad as its reputation that was set. And just because it's an even numbered Star Trek film, and the Star Trek film it's following up is probably the best and finest example of a Star Trek movie ever made, it doesn't mean that The Search for Spock is forgettable. It's a worthy entry, and I still think it's a film that I really enjoyed rewatching again. Will I rewatch it as many times after I reviewed it as Wrath of Khan? No. And you'd be crazy and stupid to ever do that, because it's never going to be as good as that, so why even try to pretend it's going to be? But as a film on its own, I still think it's a really cool Star Trek film and entry, and I like what Leonard Nimoy's different take on it. It's sort of flawed, the script doesn't entirely work, the villain certainly isn't as classic, but that's honestly not the point. I still think it is a decent blockbuster, and at least an interesting way to take the franchise. You know, if they had literally made Wrath of Khan again, I don't know if I would have liked it as much as them at least trying to be ambitious, and I think Search for Spock is actually ambitious, especially for Leonard Nimoy to make this as his feature film debut, so he could go on to direct Three Men and a Baby, but before that did Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Star Trek III: The Search for Spock was a film I loved watching as a kid. My parents would let me watch it because it was PG, and my parents loved Star Trek, so I could keep watching it over and over again, and I don't think I got the themes of death and the whole melodramatic operatic thing or anything like that, but I could watch it as a fine blockbuster and have a cool time with it, and I always did, and I can do that as an adult as well. And I think this definitely holds up as one of the better Star Trek films. It's not the best Star Trek film, and I don't think anyone would ever claim that, but it's still a worthy and sturdy film within the Star Trek franchise, even if it is an even-numbered one. So if you have seen Star Trek III: The Search for Spock and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.